I watched her smile at him, my wife, my life, choosing someone else, while the doorbell rang. That night, she didn't confess, she announced it. And I didn't react the way they expected. I collected every text, every email, every hidden message, and let the world see the truth. I exposed the affair at her work, at a gala, in front of everyone who ever admired her. She lost everything. He lost his charm. And me? I walked away, quiet, polite, triumphant. Justice served without a word of gloating. I used to think silence was strength. That's what sports taught me. You take the hit, you reset your stance, you keep moving. You don't flinch, you don't explain yourself. When I tore my shoulder my senior year and everything after that quietly collapsed, the scouts, the contracts, the version of me I thought I'd be, I learned a different kind of endurance, the kind that looks like an ordinary life from the outside. I'm 41 now. I live in a quiet suburb outside Denver. 2-car garage, maple tree in the front yard I planted myself, floors I refinished one winter when money was tight and pride was tighter. I work a normal job. I wake up at 5:30, make coffee too strong, scroll the weather even though it never changes my plans. I iron napkins on Sundays because my wife likes things neat when people come over. My wife used to say she loved that about me, the steadiness, the reliability. "You're solid," she'd say, like it was a compliment. Somewhere along the way, solid became another word for obsolete. I didn't notice when it happened, not at first. That's the thing about slow humiliation. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles in. A joke here, a look exchanged across the table that doesn't include you. Conversations that keep going after you walk into the room, then suddenly stop. We'd been married 12 years. One daughter, a shared calendar on the fridge, hers color-coded, mine mostly empty. I told myself that was normal. Careers peak at different times, people grow. I was a former athlete who learned how to be quiet. She was rising, confident, surrounded by people who spoke loudly and often about ambition, about networking, about not settling. And I was still ironing napkins. The night everything broke didn't start as a tragedy. It started as a dinner, family style, linen cloth, candles she insisted on lighting even though it was a Tuesday. Her colleagues were coming, her best friend too, people I'd cooked for before, people who laughed a little too hard when they talked about their jobs. I remember checking the door lock twice before guests arrived, not because I was nervous, just habit, control in small things. I didn't know yet that by the end of that night, control would become the only thing keeping me upright. At the time, I was still telling myself this was just another dinner, another performance, another chance to be the quiet man at the end of the table, smiling when expected. I didn't know she had already decided to stop pretending, and I didn't know that when the doorbell rang later that evening, it wouldn't just signal another guest, it would signal the end of the man I'd been silently holding together for years. People like to say marriages don't end suddenly, they erode. That's true, but erosion implies you notice the coastline changing. I didn't. I was inside the house, patching walls, convincing myself the drafts were normal. The first thing that changed was touch. Not sex, that's always the headline, but it wasn't that. It was the casual stuff, the way she used to rest her hand on my back when she passed behind my chair, the way she'd lean into me at the grocery store when she couldn't decide between brands. Those gestures vanished so quietly I couldn't point to the moment they stopped. Our routine stayed intact. That's what fooled me. We still had Sunday dinners, still watched the same shows, still argued about dumb things, trash day, whether the dog needed a new bed, but there was a delay now, a lag. I'd say something and she'd respond a second too late, like I was on speakerphone in another room. She was always on her phone. Not in the obvious way, not scrolling mindlessly, focused, smiling at things she didn't share. I'd ask what was funny, and she'd say, work stuff, like that explained everything. Her world expanded, mine stayed the same size. She started using phrases I didn't recognize, talking about energy, about outgrowing dynamics. Once, during a walk, she said, "You ever worry about getting stuck?" I thought she meant professionally. I said no. I said I'd already had my big pivot, that I liked where I landed. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Must be nice." That was new, the tone, not angry, not sad, evaluative, like she was reviewing something she'd already decided not to buy. Her friends mirrored it. Her best friend, Lauren, started calling me old school in that half-joking way that lets everyone laugh while you're supposed to nod along. At dinners, they'd talk about men who kept up, men who understood ambition. And when I stayed quiet, someone would inevitably say, "Oh, he's just being stoic." I wasn't stoic. I was listening. I noticed how often my name came up as a contrast, how my wife would tell stories where I was the punchline. Not cruelly, just enough to position herself as the sharper one, the evolving one. I told myself this was a phase, that marriages go through seasons, that confidence can look like arrogance from the outside. What I didn't realize then was that she'd already stopped seeing me as a partner. I was becoming a prop. The fade wasn't dramatic, it was administrative, like my role in her life had been quietly downgraded, no meeting required. And the scariest part? I was still trying to earn a place I already had. I didn't know yet that there was someone else filling the space she'd carved out. But the silence between us was already crowded. The mind resists betrayal before it accepts it. I didn't wake up one morning and think my wife is having an affair. I woke up and thought, that's odd. And then I stacked those thoughts in a corner and kept living. Odd was the receipts. She'd always been meticulous, digital wallet, email confirmations, nothing physical. Then one afternoon, folding laundry, I found a crumpled bar receipt in the pocket of a blazer she rarely wore. Downtown, weeknight, 2 cocktails, both expensive, both ordered within minutes of each other. I held it longer than necessary, felt the paper, smelled the faint mix of citrus and alcohol, told myself she'd gone out with coworkers. Odd was the schedule. She started staying late on Tuesdays, then Thursdays too. The explanations were reasonable. Presentations, client dinners, you know how it is. I did know how it was. I'd lived it in a different life, but the tone was wrong, defensive before I'd asked anything. Odd was the way she dressed for those nights. Not overt, but just intentional. A jacket she knew I liked, heels she didn't wear to the office anymore, perfume she saved for occasions. When I mentioned it once, casually, she said, "Am I not allowed to look good?" I backed off immediately. That's what you do when you don't want to seem insecure. Odd was her phone, face down now. She used to leave it anywhere. Kitchen counter, couch, bathroom sink. Now it lived in her hand or her bag. If a message came in while she was in the shower, she'd call out for me to ignore it. Not check it, ignore it. Once, late at night, she laughed quietly on something on the screen. Not a big laugh, controlled, intimate. I asked what it was. "Just a meme," she said, already locking the phone. I didn't ask to see it. The biggest odd thing was how small I felt bringing any of this up. Like the mere act of questioning would confirm some flaw in me. Like I'd already been cast as the jealous husband in a story I didn't know I was a part of. So I did what I'd always done. I observed. I noticed that one name came up more than others, casually, repeatedly. Mark. Mark from legal. Mark who gets it. Mark who says the same thing you do, actually. Mark who had a habit of texting during dinner and apologizing with a smile that felt rehearsed. I asked what Mark was like. She didn't hesitate. That should have been my first real warning. She's sharp, driven, knows what he wants, a little intense but in a good way. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "You'd like him." I nodded, because that's what you do when your instincts are screaming and you're not ready to listen. But that night, lying in bed beside her, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't afraid she was cheating. I was afraid she was choosing.
and I had a sinking feeling she'd already made the call. I just hadn't been informed yet.
Distance doesn't always look like absence. Sometimes it looks like politeness. She started thanking me for things she'd never thanked me for before. Dinner, driving our daughter to practice, fixing the loose hinge on the back door. It was careful, formal, like gratitude issued from a checklist. We stopped arguing. That might sound like progress, but it wasn't. We used to fight about stupid things, whose turn it was to pick a movie, whether we were being too strict with our daughter, money. Now, if I disagreed with her, she'd smile and say, "It's not that deep." That phrase became a wall. Anything I pushed back on was framed as insecurity. Anything I questioned was old thinking. Once, when I suggested she was working too much, she laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Some of us like momentum." Her social world accelerated. Mine stayed in place. She had dinners, events, weekend retreats, people I barely knew, all from her orbit. I was invited less and less, and when I was included, it felt ceremonial, like bringing a spouse was a box to check. At one gathering, a guy from her office joked, "Man, you must be glad you locked her down before she figured out how powerful she is." Everyone laughed. I smiled because the alternative would have been awkward, but I felt it then. Something cold and precise, like a measurement being taken, where I stood, what I was worth now. She didn't correct him. Later that night in the car, I mentioned it, lightly, said it made me feel small. She sighed, looking out the window. "You take everything personally." That was the moment I understood we were no longer speaking the same language. At home, she started staying up later, laptop open, headphones in. I'd come downstairs for water and see her on the couch, illuminated by the screen, typing fast, focused. If I asked who she was working with, she'd say, "Just a team." The team had become a person. I felt it. Our daughter noticed before I did. One night, she asked why Mom was always tired but never wanted to hang out anymore. I didn't have an answer that wouldn't fracture something, so I said grown-up jobs were complicated. She said, "You're not tired like that." That stayed with me. I started waking earlier, running again, pushing my body the way I used to, not to impress anyone, but to burn off the pressure building in my chest. In the quiet mornings, I replayed conversations, the looks, the jokes. There was a pattern now. I wasn't being pushed out violently. I was being phased out gently, with smiles and reasonable explanations. And somewhere inside that politeness was the assumption that I wouldn't do anything about it, that I'd accept the new version of myself she was quietly assigning. I didn't yet know how wrong that assumption was, but the distance between us was no longer something I could pretend not to feel. It had shape now, and it was growing. The version of him I met first wasn't a person. It was a composite, a highlight reel she curated without realizing she was doing it. Mark this, mark that. His name slid into conversations with increasing ease, like it had always belonged there. He was always framed in motion, closing deals, leading meetings, being sought after. A lawyer, corporate, long hours that were somehow a virtue instead of a burden. "He's intense," she'd say, admiringly. "He doesn't waste time. He expects excellence." Those words weren't neutral. They were comparisons. I noticed how she'd look at me after saying them, just a fraction of a second too long, like she was waiting for a reaction, for me to shrink or bristle or defend myself. I gave her none of that. When I finally did meet him, it was at a casual thing, a friend of a friend gathering at a bar with exposed brick and music too loud for real conversation. He was taller than me an inch or two, fit in a way that suggested time at a gym but not discipline. Expensive watch, relaxed smile. He shook my hand and held eye contact just a beat too long. "Good to finally meet you," he said, like we'd been circling each other already. He was charming, not the loud kind, the calibrated kind. He asked questions and nodded at the right moments, laughed easily, dropped references designed to signal status without sounding like bragging. When my wife spoke, he watched her, not in a subtle way, openly, appreciatively. I caught it because I know that look. I've worn it before, back when wanting something didn't feel like trespassing. She noticed too. Her posture changed around him, straighter, more animated. She touched his arm once while laughing and didn't seem aware she had done it. At one point, someone asked about my athletic background. Before I could answer, Mark jumped in. "Yeah, she's told me about that," he said, smiling. "Pretty impressive. Different kind of discipline." Different. Not better, not worse, just obsolete, a relic from a prior era. I watched how others responded to him, how quickly they deferred, how they laughed at things that weren't that funny. Power has gravity, even when it's borrowed. Driving home that night, she was quiet, thoughtful, satisfied. Finally, she said, "So what?" I asked. "What did you think of Mark?" I chose my words carefully. "He seems confident." She smiled. "He is." That was it. No balance, no mention of anyone else there, just him. From that night on, he stopped being abstract. He became the standard. Anytime I disagreed with her, there was an invisible counterargument already waiting. Mark would understand this. Anytime I chose rest over hustle, it was framed as complacency. And the worst part? She talked about him like he was aspirational, not just professionally, personally, morally, as if he represented a future she was moving toward, and I was something she had already outgrown. I could feel myself being edited out of her story in real time. What I didn't know yet was that the man she'd built in her head was already cracking. I just hadn't been allowed to see the fractures. Not yet. Once you notice favoritism, you can't unsee it. At dinners with her friends, Mark's opinions were treated like insights. Mine were treated like anecdotes. If he spoke, people leaned in. If I spoke, someone checked their phone. It wasn't overt. That's what made it worse. She'd interrupt me mid-sentence to clarify something Mark had said earlier, as if the room needed reminding of his point. If I disagreed with him, even gently, she'd jump in with, "I don't think that's what he meant," as if I'd misunderstood on purpose. Once, during a conversation about work-life balance, I said I liked being home in the evenings, being present. Lauren laughed. "That's such a you answer." Everyone smiled. My wife squeezed my knee under the table like I was a child who had said something embarrassing but endearing. I pulled my leg away. Later that night, I told her it bothered me, that I felt diminished. She didn't deny it. She reframed it. "You're reading into things," she said. "You're just not used to being around people like this." People like this? Ambitious, loud, certain? There was always an implication that my discomfort was the problem, that if I were more evolved, more confident, I wouldn't notice the imbalance. She started using Mark as a measuring stick in small, cruel ways. Mark thinks long-term about everything. Mark doesn't get defensive. Mark says men our age either adapt or fade. She said these things casually, like observations, not accusations. I stopped responding, not because I agreed, because I was cataloging. I noticed how she laughed louder at his jokes, how she angled her body toward him in group settings, how she checked her phone more frequently when he was nearby, like she was waiting for a signal only she could hear. I noticed how he never acknowledged me unless necessary, not hostility, indifference. Worse, he spoke around me, over me, treated me like part of the furniture in my own life. And my wife allowed it, encouraged it even. At home, she'd relay stories that positioned me as the contrast, me being tired, me being cautious, me being settled. Once, during an argument, she said, "I don't want to wake up in 10 years and realize I shrunk my life to make someone else comfortable." She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time. Not out of anger, out of clarity. I needed space to think. Lying there, staring at the ceiling fan I'd installed myself, I felt something shift. Not rage, resolve. I realized I'd been reacting to the surface of things, the jokes, the comments, the tone. But underneath it all was a shared assumption. They believed I was passive.
that I'd absorbed the disrespect, that I'd stay quiet to preserve the illusion of peace. They thought my silence meant weakness. They didn't understand that silence had always been my preparation, and they had no idea how much I had already seen. The dinner she'd planned for the following week, the one she was unusually excited about, was supposed to be another display, another chance for her world to orbit without me. I didn't know yet that she'd chosen that night to stop hiding entirely, and that she was about to miscalculate me in a way she'd never recover from.
The day of the dinner, the house smelled like rosemary and roasted garlic. I remember that because I'd been chopping herbs at the counter, the knife moving in steady, controlled arcs. Muscle memory. Focus. Outside, it was cold, but clear. One of those winter evenings where the sky looks sharper than usual. She was in a good mood. Too good. Music playing. Candles laid out early. She ironed the tablecloth herself instead of asking me to do it. Hummed while she moved around the kitchen. Phone lighting up every few minutes on the counter. "Who's all coming again?" I asked. She rattled off names. Colleagues, Lauren, two couples I barely knew. Then, like it was nothing, she said, "And Mark might stop by later." Might. I nodded. No reaction. I'd learned how to keep my face neutral. By 7, everyone was there. Coats piled on the guest bed. Wine opened. The usual opening act. Compliments about the house, the food, the floors. People praising work I'd done with my own hands, then drifting away from me mid-sentence. We sat down to eat. Linen napkins folded neatly. Candles flickering just enough to feel intentional. The conversation flowed around me. At some point, the topic turned to fantasies. Not explicitly sexual at first. Travel. If you could do anything. It escalated naturally, lubricated by wine and the performative intimacy people like to show off in groups. Lauren made a joke about honesty in marriage. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else said, "Careful." My wife smiled. She set her fork down. I actually think honesty is underrated, especially when it comes to desire. The table quieted slightly, subtle. People lean in when they sense something unscripted. She continued, looking directly at me for the first time all evening. "I've been thinking a lot about what I want and what we could want." I felt my chest tighten, not fear, recognition. She turned slightly in her chair, addressing the group now. "I think fantasies don't have to be threatening. They can be shared, even acted on, if everyone's mature." There it was. The air changed. Then she said it. "I've been fantasizing about the three of us, me, my husband, and Mark." The words landed like glass. Someone laughed reflexively, thinking it was a joke. She didn't laugh. She reached for her wine, took a sip, and added, "Actually, I've talked to Mark about it. He's open." I didn't hear the rest of the table react. All sound collapsed inward. I looked at her face, the confidence, the expectation. I looked around, smug smiles, curious eyes, Lauren watching me like this was entertainment. Then the doorbell rang. Perfect timing, almost theatrical. She stood up. That must be him. As she walked toward the door, someone muttered, "Wow." Another person said, "This is progressive." I stayed seated. My hands were flat on the table. I could feel the grain of the wood through the cloth. I could hear my own breathing, slow and controlled. The door opened. Mark stepped in, coat already unbuttoned, like he belonged there, like he'd rehearsed this entrance. He met my eyes and smiled, not apologetically, confidently. That was the exact moment of devastating clarity. Not that she'd betrayed me, but that they all believed I'd accept it. That this wasn't a confession, it was an announcement. And everyone in that room was waiting to see how the outdated, solid husband would react. I stood up. The chair legs scraped loudly against the floor. The room went silent. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't choose silence. I chose control. But what I said next would determine everything, and I already knew I wouldn't be walking away the same man. I didn't raise my voice. That's what surprised him. I looked at my wife first, really looked,
not the version I'd been trying to preserve in my head, but the one standing there now, shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes bright with adrenaline. "You've talked to him about this," I said, not a question. She crossed her arms, defensive already. "Yes, and before you start—" I held up a hand. She stopped mid-sentence. That alone shifted the room. "So let me understand," I said, carefully. "You invited colleagues and friends into our home. You served dinner at my table, and you decided this was the moment to announce that you're having an affair and would like me to participate." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. She laughed once, sharp. "You're being dramatic. I'm being honest." Mark stepped forward slightly, like he was about to help. That was a mistake. I turned to him. "You should stay where you are." The smile on his face faltered, just a fraction. "This is between adults," he said, calm, patronizing. "No one's trying to disrespect you." I nodded slowly. "You walked into my house knowing you were sleeping with my wife." His jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. Around the table, the energy curdled. This wasn't sexy anymore. It wasn't bold. It was uncomfortable. My wife rolled her eyes. "God, you're making this so ugly." That sentence did something to me. Not rage, clarity. I realized she wasn't embarrassed by what she'd done. She was embarrassed by my reaction, by the fact that I wasn't playing the role she'd assigned me. I leaned forward, hands on the table. "You don't get to redefine betrayal because it makes you feel evolved." She scoffed. "This is exactly why I didn't want to tell you privately. You'd make it about control." Lauren chimed in. "Maybe if you were more open—" I cut her off without looking at her. "This is not your marriage." Silence. I looked back at my wife. "How long?" She hesitated. That was all the answer I needed. I straightened. "Dinner's over." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said dinner's over," I repeated. "Everyone should leave." She laughed again, but this time there was uncertainty underneath it. "You don't get to kick people out." I walked to the front door and opened it. Cold air rushed in. The maple tree outside rattled softly in the wind. "This is my house. I refinished these floors. I pay this mortgage, and I will not host my own humiliation." People stood up slowly. Coats were gathered. No one met my eyes. Mark lingered, watching my wife, waiting for a cue. She stared at me like she'd never seen me before. "You're overreacting," she said quietly. "We could talk about this." "We will, later, privately." Mark finally spoke. "I think I should stay." I turned to him one last time. "If you're still here in 30 seconds, I call the police and report you for trespassing." That did it. He left. The door closed. The house fell into a heavy, unnatural quiet. Candles still flickered. Plates of untouched food cooled on the table. She stood there, arms crossed, breathing fast. This didn't have to be like this. I looked at her, really looked. It absolutely did, because now I know exactly who I'm dealing with. That was the moment the marriage ended. Not with screaming, with precision. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the confrontation wasn't the climax. It was the opening move. And from that moment on, I stopped reacting. I started planning.
She slept in the guest room that night. Not because I asked her to, because she needed space to reframe the story. I could feel it. The mental gymnastics already starting, how she'd explain this to herself, to others, how she'd make my reaction the problem. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't demand answers. That confused her more than anger would have. The next morning, I made coffee like usual, fed the dog, packed our daughter's lunch. The normalcy unsettled her. She watched me from the doorway like she was waiting for something to break. "Are you really not going to talk about last night?" she asked. "I am," I said. "Just not yet." I took the day off work. Didn't tell her. After she left, I walked through the house slowly, not searching, not rifling, observing, the way you do when you finally allow yourself to see what's been in front of you. Her laptop sat on the dining table, lid closed. She'd forgotten it in the chaos. I didn't open it. Not yet. I started with the obvious: trash, recycling, the mundane artifacts people forget matter. Receipts, wine bars, parking garages downtown, a hotel coffee shop receipt tucked inside a magazine. I photographed everything. I checked the shared iPad we used for streaming, messages still synced, nothing explicit, but patterns, names, times, the way conversations paused late at night and resumed early morning. I checked our phone bill online, data usage spikes on the nights she stayed late, long calls to a number not saved as a contact. Mark. I didn't confront her with any of it. Instead, I became invisible, polite, brief, functional. That's when she relaxed. She assumed the storm had passed, that I'd barked once and retreated, that I'd file this under marital rough patch and go back to being solid. She went out more, stayed later, stopped deleting everything. I learned her rhythms. Tuesdays and Thursdays weren't random. They were him. Fridays were for decompression, wine with friends, rehashing the week, shaping the narrative. I learned that Mark wasn't just a colleague, he was a fixture. She texted him from the driveway before coming inside. I saw it once through the window, her face lit by her phone, smiling in a way she never smiled at me anymore. I waited until she was asleep before opening her laptop. No hacking, no guessing passwords. She used the same one for everything. Confidence breeds carelessness. Emails, calendar invites, shared documents labeled innocuously, project notes. They weren't careful. They didn't think they needed to be. I saved everything. Screenshots, forwarded emails, dates, times, language. Not just proof of the affair, but proof of tone, the way they talked about me. Still stuck in his old mindset. He won't do anything. He's predictable. That one made me pause, not because it hurt, because it was wrong. I backed everything up to a drive I kept at work, not the house. I started a timeline, because if I was going to end this, I wasn't going to do it emotionally. I was going to do it conclusively. What I didn't anticipate was how much else I'd uncover once I started looking, not just about her, but about him, and about the quiet assumptions they'd made that would soon collapse under their own weight. The more invisible I became, the more reckless they got. That's a pattern I've since learned to trust. She started taking calls in front of me, lowering her voice just enough to signal privacy without hiding it. Mark's name appeared on her screen openly now. No disguises, no Melanie. I didn't react. That unnerved her. She tried once, tentatively, to provoke something. "You've been very calm," she said one evening, swirling wine in her glass. "It's kind of unsettling." "I'm processing," I said. She nodded, satisfied. That word meant something different to each of us. Processing, to her, meant denial, suppression, eventual acceptance. To me, it meant sequencing. The first opportunity came sooner than expected. Her firm was hosting a mid-quarter work party at a downtown restaurant, cocktail style. Clients invited, spouses optional, but encouraged. She mentioned it casually, assuming I wouldn't come. "You don't have to," she said. "It's very work-forward." "I'll be there," I said. She blinked, recovered quickly. "Okay." That night I dressed carefully, not flashy, not defensive, the version of myself that made people underestimate me most easily. At the party, Mark was already there. He saw me and hesitated, a micro-expression. Then the charm snapped back into place. She was radiant, confident, introduced me with a hand on my arm like a prop she'd decided to display. "This is my husband," she said, not my name. The room buzzed, laughter, glasses clinking, waitstaff weaving through. I watched, listened, let the pattern play out. Mark held court. She hovered close. Colleagues deferred to him. I existed at the edges. At one point, I approached the bar as she and Mark stood there together. Their shoulders touched. She stiffened when she saw me. Perfect. I ordered a drink. The bartender set it down. I turned slightly, pretending to step back, and let the glass slip. Red wine bloomed across her dress. Gasps, apologies layered over each other.
"Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I said. She froze. Shock first, then fury. Mark stepped in immediately. "Are you okay?" That did it. I reached for napkins, blotting uselessly, performing concern. Then I straightened up and raised my voice just enough. "Maybe this is a sign," I said lightly. "Spilling secrets in public never ends well." People laughed uncertainly. She shot me a warning look. I lifted my glass. "I just want to thank everyone here," I said, projecting now, "for being so welcoming. It's not easy navigating unconventional arrangements." Silence. I turned to her, smiled. You know, like when your wife brings her boyfriend to dinner and expects you to applaud? The room went dead. Mark's face drained of color. Someone whispered, "What?" She stammered, "What are you doing?" I set the glass down. "Being honest. You said honesty was underrated." I didn't wait for her response. I walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The fallout began immediately. My phone buzzed as I sat in the car. Messages, missed calls. I turned it off. That night, I slept better than I had in months, because that wasn't revenge. It was calibration, and it told me exactly how much pressure they could take before they started to crack. The real exposure was still ahead, and now they knew I wasn't predictable anymore.
The next day, the texts started. Not from her, but from colleagues she thought I didn't notice. Some polite, some confused, some snide. "Did you really do that last night? Are you okay?" She seemed upset. I ignored them. That was part of the strategy. People respond when you leave space for interpretation. Let the uncertainty grow. Let the fear start in tiny, creeping increments. I spent the morning reviewing everything I'd gathered. Emails, receipts, texts, calendar logs, screenshots. Every detail meticulously organized. Each document wasn't just proof, it was context, evidence of tone, repeated patterns, expectations. By mid-afternoon, I started forwarding small bits to a few people I trusted. Former mentors, a neighbor, my daughter, discreetly. Nothing incriminating in a legal sense yet, but enough for them to understand there was a story no one could spin. The second opportunity presented itself at another corporate event, her firm's annual gala. Big hall, AV screens, presentations, awards, a crowd I couldn't possibly ignore. I arrived quietly, not as a threat, but as an observer. She was radiant, elegant, charismatic, like a queen among her court. Mark hovered, always close, always smiling, always performing the idealized version of himself she'd built. During her speech, the first few minutes were perfunctory. I watched her carefully, noting gestures, words, pauses. Then came the signal. The tech setup had an unmonitored input I discovered while visiting the AV control. I didn't hesitate. The slideshow she'd prepared to highlight achievements flickered. First her clients, then her team, then the screen changed. Emails appeared, screenshots she hadn't deleted, texts, calendars, receipts, conversations between her and Mark, her tone, his tone, plans she thought private, every betrayal displayed, crystal clear. Gasps, murmurs. She froze. Mark's face went pale. Colleagues turned to each other, whispering. Some reached for phones. Some stared, stunned. I stayed seated, calm, watching, letting the chaos unfold. Her speech collapsed in front of everyone. Attempts to regain composure failed. She waved her hands, stammered. Mark tried to step in, but no one listened. The evidence had spoken louder than any apology, any charm. After 15 minutes, the AV was cut. Security came forward. People whispered. The night carried on, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. Outside, I waited for them to leave. Not a word to her, not a glance at Mark. By the time they arrived at their car, the narrative had shifted. Her professional credibility cracked. The social circle that had once elevated her now questioned her judgment. I stayed in the shadows, observing, not gloating,
just making sure the weight landed squarely where it belonged. I realized then how fragile people become when they believe someone silent is powerless, and I knew the next stage, the full public exposure, would finish the story. What she didn't know yet was that her fall would be complete, and it would be irreversible. After the gala, I didn't call, I didn't text, I didn't appear at work events or volunteer for school functions. I let her and Mark occupy their worlds, but on the periphery, visible yet untouchable. She tried once, a week later, sending a long text that started with I and ended with multiple ellipses. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, out of strategy. Silence had become a weapon, not loud, not confrontational, just absence. I focused on routines, morning coffee, running routes that traced the edges of our neighborhood, the smell of pine and winter air, laundry, dishes, refilling the bird feeder, my daughter's homework, normalcy, stability. Everything she had disrupted, I quietly rebuilt. She reached out again after 2 weeks, a phone call this time. "Can we talk?" she asked, voice tight. I paused, then said, "Not right now." Her sigh carried through the line. The practiced charm I used to know was missing. It was replaced with frustration, a subtle panic. She didn't understand that I no longer needed her explanations, no longer needed to defend myself to her. I started gathering allies quietly, former mentors, neighbors I trusted, even friends who had been skeptical of her behavior. I didn't ask for judgment, I just informed them of the facts, showed them timelines, screenshots, receipts, texts. People started to understand that this wasn't a marital spat, it was a pattern of manipulation, deception, and deliberate disrespect. Her social circle began to notice my absence. Invitations to events were ignored. Her attempts to talk publicly about our issues fell flat because I didn't react. The narrative she had tried to control, of me as reactive, overbearing, or jealous, crumbled silently because there was no performance for her to manipulate. Even Mark started slipping. His confidence, once magnetic, began to waver. I had documented everything, and I let him live under the constant pressure that his actions could be exposed at any moment. Meanwhile, at home, I rebuilt my environment. Spaces she had once dominated, desk, closet, storage, were reorganized. Patterns of control subtly shifted back to me. I didn't denounce it. I didn't need to. She noticed. She hated it. Detachment became my advantage. They were frantic, performing for empty rooms, worrying about appearances, while I quietly assembled the final pieces for the public reckoning. By the time the second public exposure came, I was no longer just an observer. I was the orchestrator of every consequence that would unfold, and she had no idea it was coming. The weight of inevitability was settling in. Her fall was already in motion.
The first ripple hit quietly. Colleagues who had once praised her work began asking pointed questions. Clients canceled meetings. Invitations to panels and social events vanished. Whispered conversations reached my ears through allies I'd placed strategically. The story had leaked, but carefully, legally, without my name attached. Every leak was a spotlight on her actions, not me. Mark's missteps accelerated the collapse. I had records of his arrogance, entitlement, and professional shortcuts. I shared discreetly with his supervisors and a few trusted associates at her firm. Suddenly, his previously polished persona cracked. Deals he led were questioned, references checked. His charm no longer carried weight when matched against documented evidence. She called me once that week. "Max, people are talking. This isn't fair." I answered evenly. I said honesty was underrated. The line went silent. I could almost hear the calculations spinning in her head, the realization she'd underestimated the quiet patience I'd cultivated for months. At home, I focused on the daughter, her routines, her confidence, her trust. Nothing from the public fallout touched her. She saw her mother's agitation, but didn't fully understand it, which was exactly how I wanted it. Stability was my weapon as much as patience. Lauren, her supposed ally, started avoiding me. Mutual acquaintances reached out cautiously, some with the unspoken question, "Are we on the wrong side?" I never gossiped, never bragged. I let evidence speak. Screenshots, texts, receipts, all backed by timelines. By the time anyone tried to support her, the facts were unassailable. Mark texted her one night. Frustration and panic mingled in his tone. "We can fix this." She deleted the messages before opening them. But fixing wasn't possible. Not after the work party, not after the gala, not after the strategic exposure of the truth. She called a few friends for advice. Some listened, some turned. One even quietly confirmed details I had documented. The circle she had relied on for reinforcement, the people who elevated her sense of superiority, had fractured. I stayed absent, calm, unseen, observing the dominoes fall in perfect alignment. By the end of that week, the professional damage was irreversible. The social damage was accelerating. She had miscalculated every step of my silence, and now the very people she had tried to impress were the ones confirming her failures. And the best part? I was unscathed, polite to my daughter, present in my life, steady, solid, exactly as I had always been, but stronger, strategically untouchable, because the storm I'd built didn't need violence, it didn't need rage, it needed patience, and it had just begun its final act. The culmination, the full public exposure was still ahead, and I could see it now, clear and inevitable. The annual charity gala was always her favorite night. Ball gowns, photographers, colleagues, clients, socialites, a stage perfectly built for her performance. She didn't know I had access to the AV system months before, an innocuous oversight by the event organizers that I had quietly memorized and tested. I arrived early under the guise of helping with setup. Nobody questioned me. The gala's chaos gave me cover. I had a small USB device in my pocket, meticulously prepared, a chronological compilation of emails, texts, receipts, calendar notes, every piece of the affair, every instance of her belittling me, every calculated favor she gave Mark. I placed the device in the AV laptop, double-checked connections, and stepped back into the crowd. She was radiant, confident, preening in front of sponsors. Mark hovered nearby, already expecting her to bask in admiration. When she stepped onto the stage to give her speech, everything began normally. Thank yous, smiles, photo ops. Then, as she gestured to a slideshow of corporate highlights, I activated the device. The images flickered. First, innocuous charts, then a series of screenshots, emails between her and Mark, texts detailing their meetings, her own words. "He's predictable. He'll never do anything." Receipts from dinners, hotels, messages of flirtation, the timeline displayed across the massive screen. The room froze. Cameras clicked. Colleagues whispered. She faltered mid-sentence. Mark's confident smile disappeared. Their carefully curated image of success and superiority shattered in front of the entire audience. She tried to regain control, fumbling to switch slides, but it was too late. The evidence was absolute. Nothing she could say would counter what was up there for everyone to see. Sponsors exchanged glances, friends averted eyes, questions whispered behind hands. I stayed in the back, calm, unseen, observing the dominoes fall in perfect alignment. By the time security escorted her off stage, the applause she expected for her professional achievements had vanished. The social and professional consequences were immediate.
I walked out quietly after a brief pause, watching her world crumble without a single word from me. She couldn't argue with silence, with patience, with evidence. Outside, the cold winter air hit me like clarity. She would rebuild, perhaps, but the people who mattered had seen her true character. The veneer was gone, and I had already begun rebuilding myself, quietly, away from the wreckage. The final confrontation, the reckoning in private, was the last step, and it would be short, devastating, and conclusive. Her time in power had ended. Mine had quietly begun.
I didn't seek her out immediately. I let the dust settle, let the embarrassment, the whispers, the stunned reactions echo through her world. By the time I walked back into the house, her expression was guarded, defensive, angry, but weary. I didn't smile, I didn't yell, I simply closed the door behind me. The cold air from outside lingered faintly in the hall. The maple tree swayed quietly in the winter breeze. Inside, the scent of leftover candle wax and faint perfume reminded me of the countless dinners where I had been invisible. She tried her usual tactics: pleas, justifications, blame. "It didn't have to get this far. I didn't mean for it to. People will forgive me if I explain." I didn't interrupt. I listened, cataloging tone, pacing, desperation. Then I spoke, calm, precise. "Look around," I said. "This is what happens when you underestimate someone. Not out of anger, not out of malice, but out of patience, observation, and facts." She flinched, the words sinking in. I laid out the final sequence, how I had documented everything, how I had shared selectively, legally, carefully, how every misstep, every indulgence, every attempt to spin reality in her favor had failed. Mark's career and credibility were on shaky ground. Her social and professional life had fractured, and through it all, I had remained consistent, steady, unassailable. She tried one last time to shift the focus. "You're enjoying this." I shook my head. "I'm not enjoying it. I'm relieved. Justice does not require cruelty. It just requires truth." We spoke for a long hour, not as a couple, not as a husband and wife, as two people who had built a life together, only to realize one had been rewriting the story while the other watched. When I left the house that evening, I wasn't triumphant in the way people imagine revenge. No shouting, no public spectacle, just quiet certainty. Weeks later, she moved out. Mark disappeared from her life. The social circle that once elevated her now distanced themselves. I watched from a distance as her empire crumbled quietly, methodically, without me touching a finger. I rebuilt my routines, strengthened the relationship with my daughter, refinished the maple tree's garden bed, reclaimed the home we had shared. Polite to the world, triumphant in silence. No gloating, just certainty, the kind that comes from knowing the truth is absolute and it always finds its way. I was solid again, not the passive husband, the old relic she had once mocked, stronger, patient, present, and finally in control. The marriage ended, yes, but I didn't just survive it. I outlasted it. And that, quietly, is victory.